everybody. Welcome to another episode of the From the Periphery podcast. Today marks 1 year since the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, and so we've decided to do a small episode with Leila al-Shami and Karena Avidissian. Leila, of course, from the Syria podcast, and Karena from the Periphery podcast, to talk reflections about the fall of the regime 1 year since, what's happened since. Obviously, we won't be able to cover everything, but I think we'll be able to hit on quite a bit because Syria is something that definitely for Leila, but also for all three of us has been, a focus for more than a decade. Well, more than a decade. And so, I think we'll just start with reflections. There's so many videos that are emerging now where people are filming, not just that there are protests across Syria, sort of celebrating this moment, but also videos sort of recollecting or, reflecting on the immediate collapse, which was obviously, and I think we'll get into this, not the thing that collapsed the regime, but the final blow. And so with it is also a reflection of 14 years of struggle, of the Syrian revolution. And so, I guess we'll start with Leila. What reflections do you have in this moment, this 1 year anniversary?
It's quite an emotional moment, I think, and seeing the mass celebrations that are happening across Syria these days, shows the jubilation that people feel since the regime's fallen. And I think, there's throughout this whole year, there's been a lot of optimism, a lot of joy, a sense that things are going to get better after going through, so many decades, and especially the past decade of extreme trauma, the conflict. There is a sense that now things are able to move forward, and many people are returning to Syria again for the first time. And, you really feel that joy. But then on the other hand, some of that belies the fact that it's also a very difficult situation that we're in. There's been, the state is in a state of collapse. There's so much rebuilding to be done. There's been outbreaks of extreme violence throughout this year, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. So much work to be done in terms of reconstruction, in terms of building a democratic state, which we're quite far away from still. So, there's a lot of joy and a lot of moments for celebration, but there are also some massive challenges that still have to be overcome.
I think it's really interesting watching a lot of these conversations about, this post-Assad Syria, and specifically in kind of starting to see it's like not just one future we're kind of looking at. It's these multiple futures unfolding in parallel with all the different communities in Syria, each with their own lessons, whether you're talking about Sunni Muslims, Alawites, Druze, Assyrians, Kurds, Armenians, etc. The pieces of the story look really different from that, typical geopolitical framing. And what I find interesting and what I've noticed over this time is that the conversation has moved. I mean, there's a lot of conversation still about, survival, because there's so much work still to be done. But you also see these conversations about dignity, and having this revolution from a year ago kind of opening up that space to think in ways that haven't been thought before, and to imagine different futures. So that's kind of what I've seen.
Yeah, for my part, I'm just sort of, for the past few days, been reflecting. People have been reposting things that they posted, a year ago today. And it's been very emotional because I just remember a year ago, I remember where I was. I mean, I was where I am right now, sitting here, but on this group chat with, the two of you are on it. And for the last 5 days, a year ago, we'd been seeing this thing that felt impossible, that the liberation of Aleppo and then Homs and then Hama. And I just remember, December 4 or 5, 2024, that I was talking to a friend online, and I just shared this footage of like a prison break in, I think, Hama. And she'd messaged me saying, imagine Saidnaya is next, this notorious prison complex, the site of massacres, essentially. And I cried just at the sort of like, even that it's become a possible thing. And I would have never had imagined, even in that moment when things were so, volatile, that actually 3 days later, that would become a reality. And so what's happened since is essentially, one of the largest prison breaks, I think, in history. And I don't know, I just remember being up at 2 a.m. on this group chat messaging people, being like, oh my God, they've entered Damascus. When the news was confirmed, and I had Syrian friends here in Vienna who like went out on the streets at like 5 a.m., even though it's like -4 degrees or whatever. And I went out and joined them. I, braved the cold because it was tremendous. And then even just like the sort of banal things with like, I saw someone who I didn't know had been operating for years under a pseudonym. And here she was feeling, in this moment that she shared with us her name. And I don't know, I just cried at that because it's monumental, paradigm shifting. And with it, as both of you have mentioned, a lot has happened in the last year that we'll definitely talk about. Like, there are new issues, because I think no one was under the impression that once Assad fell, that's like utopia comes right after, because you don't get 40 years under this brutal regime. Like, it's holding so many issues under it and through its violence that once that's removed, which is a necessity, I think that's basically the core demand of the Syrian revolution, that like nothing is possible until he's gone, and then there are other things. So yeah, these issues are emerging, and a lot of them are emerging kind of from under the boot of that regime.
When I wrote Burning Country with my co-author Robin Yassin Kassab, I think it was published in 2016. And there's a sentence in that book that says that the Assad regime will fall and Syrians will have their moment of celebration, but building a democratic, secure and stable state out of the ruins is going to be an almost impossible task. And I think that's the point where we're in now. We've had our moment of celebration. It's been a long honeymoon period, not for everyone, of course, because some communities have experienced a worsening in their situation since the fall of the Assad regime. But for many Syrians, it has been a year somewhat of this honeymoon period. And now we're at the stage where we really need to start thinking critically about some of the challenges that we're facing.
No, yeah, 100%. And I do think it's, as you note, very important to note that for a lot of people, things have gotten a lot better. I mean, just the very fact that people are able to return, and that millions of Syrians, I don't know if we have exact numbers, have returned, but they know they've returned to ruins and to a failed state, essentially, like a state that was so collapsed already, with new issues emerging both internally and externally, as in from Israeli bombardments, most specifically. So yeah, I guess let's get into it. I can talk a bit about Sweida, I guess.
Yes, it would be good, Ayman, to have your reflections on Sweida, because I know that was a very emotional time for you. You come from the Druze community yourself in Lebanon. How's that impacted you? What happened?
It was really difficult. Like, I think seeing the footage of the massacres, especially of the assault on Druze sheikhs, on our clergy, I have never really had too much attachment to the Druze community. I am from the Druze community in Lebanon, but I think it's like literally seeing a sheikh who I'm very familiar with, is that type of person, that look, whatever, and shaving off the mustache. Like, it was very painful, it was very difficult. But then it was also difficult, a lot of the discourse, the sort of sectarian discourse I saw online from a lot of people I had a lot of respect for. that pinned it all on al-Hijri, the sheikh, who's a very shady character, a very shitty person. Just a couple of days ago, there are these two other sheikhs that were found like tortured and murdered in Sweida. And it's a lot of it is suspected to be a kind of crackdown by the al-Hijri sheikh, who, again, I should note, is the one who is openly advocating for Israeli intervention on their behalf. So it's been very turbulent. It's been very difficult, and it's not as clear cut in terms of, because again, al-Hijri is a problem even internally to Sweida, aside from his conflict with al-Sharaa. And there's been a lot of emergence of a kind of general accusation of the Druze as being Zionists, which is, again, another added thing that's very difficult to find yourself in a situation where it's like you have to argue the most basic thing of like, no, I am absolutely not a fucking Zionist. And the Druze writ large are not. And then obviously then it gets conflated with the Druze of Palestine and the Golan Heights. But anyway, what I've definitely noticed from that, which is a new thing since the fall of the Assad regime, with these conflicts between the Sharaa administration and not just al-Hijri, but the whole Sweida province, because again, it isn't just about him. Like, the whole province has been under siege. I don't know about it right in this moment, but for months. But what's happened since is that there's this reemergence, or I think an emergence, of a kind of trans-regional Druze politics. I now, for the first time in my life, am part of like two different groups that are like Druze from Palestine, from Lebanon, from Syria, kind of like talking, to each other and trying to politicize ourselves and understand the situation from a Druze perspective, but also from like as the Druze have done historically, an awareness that we are a minority and we want to work within whatever. This is why someone like Sultan Bashar al-Atrash in Syria was such a big figure nationally, because he didn't want to separate. He didn't want to be independent and like separate the province, which is now a very scary call, in my opinion, from people in Sweida talking about secession. But anyway, that in a nutshell is, I think, some of the things happening in Sweida. It's still very much in the air. It's still very much like a fresh conflict. And I think it's very deep because, yeah, we are talking about things that I've seen through my research and reading to be quite historical, and like historical issues that were kind of like, the issue was suppressed through the violence of the Assad regime. And once that was gone, then it sort of, they sort of reemerged, but they were always there. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I'm sorry if I went on too long about that.
No, that was really good context and deep context, actually. If I can just segue a bit, because I think, given my time in Northeast Syria and the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria, also known as Rojava, the view from there is really connected, I think, to the Druze issue in Sweida, because just in terms of these sort of entities, these territories, spaces that are either fully autonomous, like in the case of Northeast Syria, or kind of semi-autonomous, and aren't under Damascus's control directly. That the violence that has erupted there is being watched from the Northeast with a lot of concern and worry that if the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the sort of army of Northeast Syria, wasn't there to protect it, there's this idea that it would also descend into the same kind of violence. And that has increased the anxiety about this stage of this kind of post-Assad Syria that we're in right now, because the model that has been built in Northeast Syria, it's one that Damascus didn't build and still doesn't quite know how to deal with. And it's been signaling its intent to absorb the autonomous administration, and even talking about integrating the SDF into the Syrian army. And I think, if one were to listen to the sort of geopolitical commentary around Syria from the outside, it might sound like kind of progress, right? quote unquote progress toward unification. But that move would really put at risk that one part of Syria where a different model has actually worked, with all of its, drawbacks and problems, which, of which there are many very, very serious ones. But, women are in positions of power, communities do govern together, neighborhood councils have real authority. And it's this democratic experiment that's held throughout all this time. And the view from there is very much that that's now under threat. And I say that also, knowing that, I've also seen it, Assad's fall was celebrated in the region. I mean, there was a bit of worry, but it was generally welcomed. And, portraits of Assad were pulled down and spray painted over, et cetera. So, there were celebrations also there. So it's not, it's not a kind of one, monolith. You kind of look at that and say that they weren't happy with Assad. No, they were. But I think this connects to the way these sort of broader conversations, discussions often treat unification as something that's inherently positive, but without asking whose terms that unification reflects. And, while, Assad's fall was, should have been celebrated, a lot of the people who did celebrate that aren't really confronting the violence that has emerged afterward, the reprisals, the forced displacement of different communities, especially Alawite and Druze. And I think the US's embrace of al-Sharaa and is something they're also watching and seeing as a contradiction. They're kind of seeing, I think in many spaces, this legitimization of this new centralized order that might be, replacing the old one. And, for some, it may look the same in terms of its capacity for repression. So it's, these legitimate fears that I think aren't always discussed in a lot of the conversations around Syria, that this integration could mean the rollback of lots of rights, loss of minority protections, more minoritized people's protections, the disappearance of this one model that has been built on coexistence rather than domination. So that's the concern there from below.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Karena. I definitely do think that, it's been quite clear. And again, from the research that I've been doing, I just remembered the video essay that I'm referring to is my video essay on the Druze, which is available on my channel, because it deals with, I've got like a good 20-minute section there about the history and political dynamics of the Druze in Syria. But yeah, that like there's always been this sort of conflict or like contradiction between like Damascus trying to basically, like the Damascus government trying to bring in the three main regions, like separate from Damascus, which are the Sahel coast, the Druze, the Sweida region, and the Kurds of the north. But yeah, so I've definitely noticed, and I think Leila, you can speak to this, that with the emergence of a kind of new, I don't know if I can call it identitarian politics, but like the kind of definitely in amongst the Druze, there's this emergence I've experienced, as I mentioned, of a kind of like identity with being Druze, and yeah, I don't know. I think Leila, you could mention a bit about this kind of new emergence of a kind of Sunni identity politics, if we can call it that.
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing much more emergence of identity-based politics across Syria's diverse communities. And Karena and Ayman have both explained how that's happened within the Kurdish community and the Druze community and some of the reasons for that. But it's also been very prominent amongst the Sunni community. The Sunni community was the community which suffered the most under the Assad regime. It was Sunni Muslims who were driven from their homes, who faced chemical attacks, who were tortured en masse in prison. And they very much feel that they've gone through this horrendous suffering, and that now is their time, and now is the time of the Sunni community as the majority community to have the state that they have always wanted. And of course, HTS has long positioned itself as a defender of Sunni Muslims. So the question is, to what extent a state can be built which provides the space for all of Syria's diverse communities to feel that they can participate. And there's so many conflicts and tensions with that because, people often talk about it in terms of regionalization, that there's a Kurdish northeast, that there's a Druze south, etc. But Syria isn't divided like that. Most of Syrian communities are very mixed. There's Kurds in the northeast, of course, but there's also many Kurds in Aleppo, in Damascus, in various areas. So this idea that you could carve up Syria according to ethnic or sectarian lines is really impossible to achieve that without massive forced displacement of the communities that don't fit into those neat categories. But I think this is one of the things that I'm most concerned about now, is this forming of this strong Sunni identity going forward, and what that means for Syria as a place for all Syrian citizens. What's needed now is to build a concept of citizenship based on belonging, not based on rigid ethnic or religious identities.
No, yeah, I think it's a really important point, actually, that, and it has this historical parallel. So, like, one thing that I really stress in the video essay, and it's a message that I see people conveying both to the Druze of Sweida and to just Syrian society writ large, which is the figure of Sultan Bashar al-Atrash. Because not only are we talking about him as a figure in the 50s and the like, but even back in 1925, there was the Great Syrian Revolt against the French Mandate. And they wanted to carve the country up into, what we see, some of these demands for splitting Syria up into a Alawite coast and a Sunni Damascus and a Kurdish north. And a part of the uprising was a rejection of that, that started from Sultan Bashar al-Atrash and people in Sweida. It then traveled to across the country of no, we want the independence that, speaking to the French, that you promised us, the independence of Syria as a unified state. And rejection of the carving up of this kind of split Syria. And so in this moment wherein there are calls, we can talk maybe about the calls for federalizing or something, or decentralizing, but for secession is kind of ludicrous on both sides. Like the calls from within Sweida to secede, but also the calls from kind of more sectarian thinking other people in Syria of they're different from us, or they should be brought under our boot or something. Because again, and that has a lot of historical parallels, but regardless, one thing that for me is something that I try to hold together, and I think it speaks to a lot of what you were just describing, Leila. It's very difficult, but to hold this, especially in the moment. I referred earlier to the scenes of the Sunni extremist militants in Sweida, who are part of the so-called new Ministry of Interior or something, grabbing a Druze sheikh and shaving his mustache, right? Because I know, and very few people know, and it's very hard because it's no excuse for that behavior. But that these same men and these same people, only 10 years ago, when we have the footage, I put it in the video about the Druze, the exact same form of humiliation and torture was done unto them. That the Shabiha, the government, whatever, the state kind of paramilitary, whatever you want to call them, would grab Sunni men and religious men with beards, and pull it off and shave it and tell them to bark in camera and whatever. And so when you see something like that and you try and hold those together, you're very aware of the cyclical nature of this violence, of the trauma that Syrians writ large, but yes, specifically the Sunni communities faced under the Assad regime. And so again, it's no excuse at all for them then turning around and doing the same to others. But it has that kind of, the cyclical trauma and violence that I think is plaguing the society writ large.
I think this is one of the big questions, isn't it? We've inherited such a legacy from Assad. The sectarian breakdown of Syrian society was something which was engineered by Assad and by the former regime. But the question now is how to move beyond that, and also in terms of the authoritarian structures of the state? Is this a point in which we're creating something new, a new system, a new structure, which works for everybody? Or is the idea just now that the majority who was so disadvantaged under Assad, that they now take the power, but the actual structure of the state doesn't change? And I think that's what's very worrying. I remember when I was in Damascus earlier this year and talking to people about the violence that had happened on the coast, primarily targeting the Alawi community. And I heard a lot of people kind of just shrug it off, and say, well, it's their turn now. And this is terrifying for me, how we move beyond that mentality, how we move beyond the idea that the majority who was persecuted before now takes the power, but doesn't really change the dynamics of the dynamics and the conflicts that were happening between the different communities.
I feel like a lot of these conversations that are happening around, how things look moving forward and how, different communities can move forward in a more kind of pluralistic way, are being disrupted or hijacked. I mean, disrupted is maybe the better word, by the other powers like the US, for example, which is, thrown, at least put a lot of its kind of faith in Damascus. And the US Special Envoy for Syria, Tom Barak, who we all love, was asked just recently on Saturday whether decentralization is possible in Syria. And I think, I'm bringing this up because, we're talking about, potential models of Syria moving forward that could work for everyone. But then, the US comes in and says, well, in Barak's case specifically, he said, quote, decentralization has never worked in the Middle East. That was his response to the question. And, you kind of have to ask who the centralization is actually for. Who does it work for? Because it rarely serves the communities. And obviously there's, a historical record full of centralized states that collapsed because they refused to give any power to local communities. And Assad Syria is actually itself an example of that.
Yeah, Tom Barak is someone that we're plagued with in Syria and in Lebanon. He's a curse, him and Ortegas. Tom Barak in specific, because he's weirdly honest, but also he's got his weird analyses of the because if he says that decentralization doesn't work, that kind of conflicts with what he said a month ago or 2 months ago, where it's like there are no nation states. It's just like in the Middle East, it's a collection of tribes and clans and families. So wait, isn't that decentralization? What are you talking about?
I think the point Karena makes, though, about this fear of decentralization is really determined by external factors is very important, because one of the things I hear why people are so nervous about decentralization is the question, how can we build a strong state? How can we build a state that can resist Israel if we're broken up into lots of different communities and statelets? But I don't see decentralization like that. I see it as a way to actually build unity through giving communities more autonomy to feel that they're participating in the future direction of Syria.
Speaking about foreign powers, I wanted to actually pose a couple questions to you about the view from the ground about foreign powers in Syria and the ones that have the most influence on it. But I want to start that by pointing out, I've just pulled this up before our conversation when I was quickly kind of going over information about what's been happening. So the US has just put out, from last month, November 2025, there's a new US national security strategy about Syria. And it says, quote, this is a quote from it, Syria remains a potential problem, but with American, Arab, Israeli, and Turkish support may stabilize and reassume its rightful place as an integral positive player in the region.
Oh, God.
There are also contradictions
So
just in there because, like,
I know.
Israel and Turkey don't have the same interests in Syria at all. Like, they have opposing
Very much
interests.
opposed.
Yeah.
Exactly. So what's the sort of, since Assad's fall, I mean, the Russians have been there, there's been Turkish involvement, et cetera. What's changing now in terms of that, if anything? I just wanted to ask that question.
It's a big question. I guess, I mean, so okay, I think the primary thing that I've seen from Syrians writ large is that the lifting of sanctions, that the sort of opening up of a potential for investment to rebuild their homes, their communities, is just positive. Like, it's not, you know what I mean?
I mean, there's definitely a realization amongst Syrians that they're living now in a extremely weak state, both economically, the economy is completely destroyed, but also from a security perspective, because during the battle for liberation, as you know, Israel completely destroyed the military capabilities of the Syrian state. So I think people feel very dependent on foreign powers, not only for economic recovery and for investment to get the country operational again, but also from a security perspective. And certainly, I mean, this shows, as was just pointed out, that the interests of Israel and Turkey are quite opposed, because I think many Syrians see a strong relationship with Turkey, with the Gulf states and with the US as the only protection that they have really from this genocidal neighbor that's, just expanding across the region.
Yeah. And I mean, just the other day, there was this massacre that the Israelis committed in Syria, and they are occupying more territory within Syria and in Lebanon. And I mean, amongst everything else we're seeing, and there's definitely this remaking. I mean, they keep talking about this new Middle East, and a part of it seems to be that Israel, with US approval, although it gets a bit confusing from some of the messaging from Trump vis-a-vis Syria, but that they do not want to have any, strong states, sovereign states around it. And so, like we've been seeing in Lebanon, that even though there's this ceasefire, supposedly, that there's these regular attacks in the south, ground incursions, even attacks in Beirut. Likewise, we've been seeing that in Syria. And with that said, I don't think, like a lot of people say, that there's a very strong, like, clear strategy, and that there's that I think vis-a-vis Syria, there is conflicting interests even from the US and Israel. Because I think ultimately what Sharaa and Sharaa's administration presents to the US, to Turkey, to the Gulf is a massive investment opportunity. Like, I see it so economically that here's this state that's going to need a lot of money to rebuild. And so for the Gulf, that's just like, like, I don't see it ideological. I don't see it necessarily whatever, but it's so much of it functions in my mind kind of economically.
Of course, yes. I mean, it's clear that Israel's interest is to destabilize Syria, to keep sectarian conflicts, not allowing it to rebuild as a strong state that could pose a threat to Israel. But it seems that Turkey, the Gulf, and the US have a very different view to that and do want to work with Ahmed al-Sharaa to build stability. And I agree with you, Ayman, a lot of that is about not ideological, but it's about investment opportunities.
So, I mean, building off of the question, Karena, that when we're talking about regional influences, and again, that's like a huge factor that's there. Like, we can't dismiss it by saying, like, it's only about local things. Like, even HTS, very supported their military capabilities, their alliances. A lot of it is Turkish based, or the Gulf. And obviously we've seen this embrace from the Gulf, from the US, of al-Sharaa. But with it, and this has been a problem, and I want to make a video soon titled basically like how the left lost its mind over Syria. Because at the moment there is still this, like, if you go online and you see discussions on Syria, there's so much incoherence and there's so much noise. And there's so much myth making that has existed for a while, and it still exists, but now it's even more absurd because it's not as simple. So basically, one good example is that people seem to have it just very assumed that al-Sharaa is a US or Israeli plant, that they created Al-Qaeda, that creates HTS, that creates whatever. That obviously gets mixed in with this very long-standing thing of like Assad was good, but now like when people talk about al-Sharaa being an Israeli plant, but then you have al-Hijri in Sweida, who is very directly calling for the Israelis to intervene. And so what's that all about? Like that kind of conflicts, no? And so there's so many of these things that are like just like basic contradictions. Or then if he's a plant, why are the Israelis attacking him? Like attacking, when they attacked the Ministry of Defense only a few months ago in the center of Damascus. There's sort of this really frustrating thing where there's just so much noise online that I think, I don't know, I definitely do want to do a few things, even though I'll definitely get a lot of shit for it, but to just reestablish a kind of like basics, how we got here, very much aware, yes, there are regional influences, international influences, but that doesn't determine the Syrian revolution from 2011. Al-Jumhuriyya actually wrote a very good post that I shared on my Instagram that I'll put the link to in this video because I think it was very good, reminding people that December 8 of last year was the final blow to a regime that had been hollowed out, both in popular support and because of its 14-year counter-revolutionary war, that had hollowed out the state and the regime such that when these militants came from the north, that there was no regime to defend. People weren't trying to resist it. There wasn't these dedicated policemen or soldiers. They were like, no, we're going to fight for this regime. They just dropped their guns and ran. Anyway, sorry. So just to say, it's been very frustrating, and I think people need to do a lot of work to be like, to re-coherenticize the narrative, even though it's very difficult.
I mean, Syria's consistently taught us that the left, or large sections of the left, don't allow facts to get in the way of ideology. And that's continuing to play out. I mean, so much of the noise has been about whether al-Sharaa is running Syria as a Salafi jihadist emirate, and it's quite clear as well that that's not the case. But this discourse takes over from focusing on the real questions, because the real question should be that people should be asking themselves, is this an authoritarian regime or a democratic regime? Syrians have suffered and struggled and fought for over the past decade for democracy, and is democracy being built now in Syria? And that's where I think the focus of discussion should be.
I remember you said in an interview or in one of our discussions that if Palestine reveals the hypocrisy of liberals, then Syria reveals the hypocrisy of leftists. And I just thought that was very powerful, and it's kind of stuck with me ever since.
Yeah, so true.
Because again, and this is the kind of thing that I've been thinking, and I don't want to phrase it in this way, but because now I'm on YouTube, I've got to do a lot of clickbait titles, and I'm now thinking in terms of clickbait titles. So the title I'm thinking is like, why I'm not afraid of AI. I don't like it because I'm very afraid of AI, but just this thing that my entire life, for the last 15 years of my adult life, I've been seeing images of bombed out cities, of massive destruction, for the first part mostly with Syria, and seeing all these people being like, seeing the bombed out cities and saying, oh, it's because of those other people, not blaming the people doing the bombing, i.e. Assad and Russia. And now, and I mean, obviously there have been other cases, but now in the extreme case of Gaza, you get a lot of liberals, a lot of Zionists, a lot of people seeing that destruction. A lot of the footage looks a lot, the same. And that's why you have people who literally defend Assad having posted photos of children in Syria and bombed out buildings and neighborhoods, blaming the Israelis, not being aware that what they're posting is the destruction done by their, daddy, Assad and Putin. So like the parallels are there, but then it's like two completely opposing groups kind of commenting on it. And I find that very frustrating. Like people are very opposed, obviously, and very outraged when Israel destroys and attacks healthcare workers. But then those same exact people, only and still have this like illusion that the white helmets, are just foreign backed whatever, in the same way that the Zionists say of the Palestinian healthcare workers, they're all funded by Iran or whatever, that there's this big plot against us, this kind of like imperialist plot against us or whatever. And so yeah, it's very frustrating, and trying to then get just a kind of coherent narratives out of people, which I know is like been a thing for a very long time.
I mean, kind of similar parallel is also, a lot of the ire and frustration about foreign involvement has, been rightly directed at Israel for the violence that it is committing in Syria, and kind of the encroaching kind of capture of territory, etc. And there's very little, I've noticed, discussion about the same sort of similar actions from Turkey, which is taken and occupied swaths of land in the northeast and displaced lots of people, doing actually again another parallel to Israel and Palestine, stealing olive trees, literally stealing them, like digging them out and taking them across the border to sell. I mean, not mentioning the massacres, etc. And I've read recently another report about the displacement, about it having affected some of the groups there, including Syriacs and Armenians who have been targeted by Turkey for genocidal violence in the past. So, this is Syrian territory that this is happening in. So there's some kind of threads being left out, just because I think, Turkey is being seen as something, a force that could counter Israel's violence. So that, people get left in the middle, ordinary civilians. So I think it's important that the conversations really, apply in terms of principles rather than who's behind the violence and who's stopping who.
No, and again, the narrative, I've noticed that basically the narrative trumps the facts completely. And so like Turkey is no ally of the Palestinian, there's so much that Turkey could be doing. And I think they're still not at a national level, like, boycotting and divesting from Israel. Ports are being used and whatever. In the same way that Russia, I saw a kind of report the other day that like Russia has supplied 40% of the oil needed for Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. And people still kind of see it as a counterweight to US imperialism, which is like, that's just not, that's not true. Painting it as some kind of, similar to the Soviet Union, like a supporter of third world struggles or whatever. It's just absolutely not. Which again is just very frustrating, because we're not talking the same language sometimes. And sort of, this is why I think that I describe it as an incoherent narrative.
And once again, the discussion on Syria is really dominated by geopolitics, and people are not looking so closely at the internal dynamics and what's happening on the ground. And there's many important things to follow, like the construction of the new government, the transition to democracy, the new constitution that's being written. The issue of transitional justice is such a key issue for Syrians, because so many of them lost family members to the massive prison system that the Assad regime had. And, this is a key issue for Syrians, is are those war criminals going to be held to account or not? And the international media isn't so interested in those questions.
No, I mean, like, for the last few days, one of the biggest discussions I've seen on like Syrian online spaces has been around the disappeared and the imprisoned. And there's some new documentary that a lot of people are taking issue with, like from those communities, because very insensitive handling of a very, very sensitive file. And you wouldn't get that sense if you, from any other, media outlet, that this is something that's like being very heavily discussed and like there's a lot of activism and a lot of, yeah, discourse around.
An organization released again thousands of photographs of victims in the prisons who were tortured, a bit like the Caesar photos that happened a few years ago, but much, much larger. And as you said, there was a lot of anger and upset from Syrians at the way this information was just released and made public without the cooperation of the families of the victims and their civil society representatives.
No, yeah, and it's a huge discussion, but again, just to illuminate the point that that's not reflected at all in any other coverage of Syria, which I think is, to me, in any situation, and I remind people that, like people have done, and I think it's a great thing with Palestine, where it's like listening to Palestinians, centering those discussions in your discussions, knowing people's names and like what their struggles are, I just think that's something that people, even on the left, especially maybe even on the left, neglect. And so one question I would have to people is like, can you name like 1, 2, like 5 Syrian activists? And yeah, anyway, whatever. And then following them and listening to them and seeing these kind of translations, whatever, even if you don't speak Arabic, because I think that's the real deal. That's the real thing. On that note, one thing I've seen from a lot of Syrian accounts and people, especially this an emergence, flourishing of Syrian satire accounts or like comedy accounts, is this kind of essentially memeification of Bashar al-Assad. Have either of you seen these things?
I've been on quite a prolonged social media break, so I haven't, Ayman, but tell us a little bit about it.
So basically, it's been like a year, and I've never seen these before. I used to follow Syrian comedy pages before, but now there's definitely like an emboldening of kind of Syrian satire. Like we've had this in Lebanon, like we have Lebanese meme pages, and we've had them for quite a while. But anyway, so yeah, I think Karena, you described it very well. It's basically like the new Rickroll, wherein it's someone. I saw one the other day from someone called, I think, Levantine Diva, a page, and it's a clip from High School Musical or something, and it's just her telling someone like, "Give me a beat." She wants a beat for while she like exits the room to be dramatic, and then as she's walking, the beat starts, and it's some Assadist song, Allah Surya Bashar, da, 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 da. And sometimes it's sped up, and there's a few songs that are being repeated over and over again. There's a lot of like photoshopped images of Bashar al-Assad like planted into people's faces in a kind of way, same with like Charlie Kirk. You haven't seen these? The other one,
This is so funny.
yeah, there's a Lebanese meme page called WKM News, and oftentimes they post things that a lot of people, I even saw Al Jazeera reporting the like, hey, have a lot of you have seen this and it's being shared. This is not a real news, um, in that kind of like satire way of like a kind of the Onion. That yeah, like Cillian Murphy is plugged to play Bashar al-Assad in the new biopic. And there's just like a lot of comedy or whatever, and I don't know. I've never seen it, and I think I'm trying to analyze it. It's a thing, but I'm trying to analyze it a bit of why.
Why now? There's this wave.
I mean, there's definitely an openness to speak that didn't exist before. But I mean, opposition media, that didn't really stop them before. So I'm not sure why it's come about now.
I think there's more of an openness now. Maybe I'm just theorizing to laugh at him,
Yeah.
or also to laugh at the situation of the absurdity of this person who talked about being, forever regime, and then overnight gets on a plane and just flees.
And it's not just the Assad as like the songs and stuff. There's the meme also about him in Moscow, the different memes about what he's doing there, like playing video games, or I don't even know. It's not even real. It might be real,
It's real,
but
yeah,
I
it's
don't
not
know.
even a meme.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's just so surreal.
Mm. It's surreal, and I think there's a coping with the surreal through these memes. But yeah, a part of a kind of ridicule because it's his regime's over.
I mean, maybe that's one of the points because it's over. There was always, some kind of inward feeling of guilt if you're laughing at some comedy from a guy who was in the midst of this mud slaughter and horror.
I mean, I had this one moment when I was in the autonomous administration in Northeast Syria that really drove home how big the fear was. And I think maybe for listeners who aren't that familiar with the Syrian context, it might be helpful to hear this, that I was speaking to an Armenian woman and she was talking about Assad, but I didn't realize she was talking about him because she wouldn't mention him by name. And I was like, wait, who? And she's like, the one who fell from power. I was like, oh. And this is 5 months after Assad fell. She's still like not uttering his name. And that's just to give folks an idea of the level of fear.
Yes, it was very strange for me being back in Syria and being able to talk politics in a loud voice in cafes and restaurants. It took me quite a period of adjustment to feel comfortable doing that too.
No, and I think a lot of people on the outside don't understand how absurd the Assad regime was in and of itself and the way it would rule. I mean, I remember one video from December 8, December 9, like the day after, of someone driving around yelling the word dollar, overjoyed. Dollar, dollar. Why? Because it was forbidden to talk about dollars. Why? Because of the economic inflation and the collapsed economy alongside the Lebanese one. And so with the inflation rate, the dollar became a kind of very important asset. And so, there was also this like arbitrary nature of the regime that was intentional because you wouldn't know how to situate yourself. So you kind of like self-regulate all the time. It was like a maddening thing. There's also footage from the last period before the fall of just like people kind of going mad.
Some of the most seminal work on cults of personality were actually on the Assad family. There's a book called Ambiguities of Domination by a woman named Leila Wadeen. I think she's Syrian American, if I'm not mistaken.
It's a wonderful book.
Yeah. It was because I had been doing research on the cult of personality of Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen leader. And Leila Wadeen's book, Ambiguities of Domination, was recommended to me as like a model for analyzing cults of personality and all the sort of cultural bits around it that just get kind of absorbed into a society. And I remember one of the things that she had said was, there's like the suspense. There's something about this concept of believing or not believing, right? Because the cult of personality around the Assad family kind of positioned them as these like superhuman. Assad's daughter was like the best mathematician in the whole country as a student. Obviously not, but you kind of had to believe it, right? Or at least not, reject the claim publicly. But she had found, for example, evidence in the fact that people did not believe this stuff. Like, obviously they don't, but, as an academic, you have to kind of find the evidence. And she found the evidence in the jokes around the Assads. So obviously, like, they're making fun of it. And there was, the one way that you could kind of get around the self-censorship. And I mean, you don't say those jokes to everybody, but that was the one kind of thing that she found circulating throughout Syrian society as that example.
It's also very cathartic, isn't it? That kind of humor.
Yeah.
It's also a way to deal with and process trauma.
And not feel so isolated. And
Exactly.
There's others, yeah.
I mean, in general, the reason that I brought this up and I'm thinking a lot about it is because I've noticed that in Lebanon, there's so many meme pages. And to me, it's like some of the only places where there's like some sort of generative political thinking or discourse. because I've got a lot of analysis as to why, but genuinely, like, if you want to deep dive into Lebanese politics, follow the meme pages. Like, there are a lot of in-jokes, which is why it's so exclusive, but that's how it functions. And so, yeah, I've just been thinking a lot about satire and the state of our region in general, and the absurdity and the kind of surrealness, but also the kind of extreme nature of it all, and the volatility of it all.
There was a wonderful puppet show in the early days of the revolution that was online where Bashar was mocked and different security officials were mocked. Was it called Top Goon or something like that? The Stories of a Little Dictator.
I don't know about this.
Very popular in the first years of the revolution.
Interesting. If you have any links to that or any...
I will have a look.
Yeah, we could put them in the description. So yeah, I guess in wrapping up, do either of you have any sort of like closing thoughts about like this moment now and thinking a bit forward and just sort of like hopes or predictions or, you know, just thoughts about, you know, the next year?
Well, for me, I hope the next year is where we really move on some of these fundamental issues that we've raised of, you know, trying to build a democratic system, trying to heal the trauma between communities, working on issues like transitional justice. I mean, we've had a year now to kind of come to terms with the changes that have happened, but now the real work going forward has to begin.
The kind of looking again at from northeast Syria, the ongoing negotiations with Damascus, between Damascus and northeast Syria about integration have stalled. There's sort of statements made here and there that the intention is to, you know, overcome these challenges that they're encountering, but there is also a growing sense that, you know, there's growing signs of potential war or conflict. So my concern is there, and hopefully nothing like that will happen, and that, as Leila just said, the conversation be centered around how communities are going to be living together, how they're represented, how enfranchisement might look, and kind of getting out from these overly kind of geopolitical, you know, macro views that kind of refocus the attention on people's everyday lives and their dignity.
Going forward, I'd like to see more internal criticism of the new authorities than there has been in the past year, really trying to hold them to account to ensure that there is a democratic transition. And, you know, for many reasons, some of which we've discussed, that hasn't been that visible from the Sunni Muslim majority community. Of course, this is a huge generalization, but there is still a lot of hero worship of the new president, and hopefully we're not going to go into another round of cult of personality that Karen has just been talking about.
Yeah, there's a phrase that probably we should have mentioned earlier that is sort of fundamental or like sums up a lot of that, which is man yuharrir yuqarrir, who liberates, decides. And it's this thing that sort of al-Sharaa liberated the country, and therefore he gets to decide what happens to it, which is, I mean, plainly false from many different perspectives, but also worrying if it moves in that trajectory. So hopefully it'll, like you're saying, more discussions, more internal critiques and discussions, which I see already happening in a way that would have been impossible under the Assad regime. People coalescing, people protesting. Again, it's not utopia, but it's very, very different.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the freedom for speech and criticism has improved exponentially in Syria from what there was before. But the question is whether people will use those new freedoms for the greater good.
So, thank you both. I thought this was a lovely conversation. Thank you all for listening to another episode of the From the Periphery podcast. As a reminder, if you like this episode, if you like the work we do, please consider becoming a member of our Patreon, which is patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. And your support would mean that we'd be able to make more episodes like this and keep our work going. We are mostly community funded. And yeah, we strive to continue bringing conversations like these into your ears and hopefully your hearts. So with that said, thank you, Karena and Leila.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Ayman. Thank you, Leila.
And thank you all for listening. From the Periphery is a worker-owned media collective. We focus on elevating voices, struggles, and ideas that are peripheralized and marginalized under mainstream journalism and academia. If you like the work we do and want to see more of it, please consider heading over to patreon.com and become a member today. For as little as $5 a month, you get access to exclusive content, an invitation to our monthly hangout, and to join the community that's been growing around our work. If you can't support financially, there are still a number of ways you can support us. You can leave a 5-star rating on the podcast app you're using to listen, like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, and leave a comment wherever you're listening, all of which helps us against the algorithm. Most importantly, tell your friends and family about us to help spread the word. Thank you so much for listening.